My name is Eliza, Aierstuck. I'm going to be talking to you today about accessibility-driven development. I know it's not exactly the name that was on the abstract, but the content is going to be very similar, and I hope that you like it. So before I talk to you about accessibility, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about me. I work for Pivotal, specifically the consulting arm of Pivotal, which is called Pivotal Labs. And working for Pivotal Labs is pretty cool because I get to work with a variety of different technologies. I've listed a few of my favorites up there. I really enjoy working with Ruby on Rails, Spring, which you have all heard of, I'm assuming. I've spent a lot of time working with React. I like to layer TypeScript on top of it. And recently, I got the experience to work with .NET Core, which was a lot of fun as well. In working with different clients, I get to teach my clients a lot of things. So I get to teach my clients about domain-driven design and how to incorporate that into architectural decisions. I get to teach my clients about test-driven development and how to do that. Another thing I get to teach them is about how to build accessible products. So here's an example, a few of the clients that I have worked with on specifically accessibility. So I was introduced to it when I was working for an agency under the Department of Homeland Security, and then I was working with it when I was working for the Department of Defense, and I've worked with a few commercial clients as well on it. So the agenda, first we're going to start by talking high level, what is accessibility? Then we'll talk about why you should care about it. We'll approach it from the moral, the legal, and then the practical perspective. After that, we'll get to some low-hanging fruit, hopefully some things that you can leave here today and start doing immediately. And then I'll try to give you some tools and resources that you can use to look into it on your own in the future. Ally, sometimes you'll see accessibility said, expressed like this. It's just slang. It's like the A11Y. And this symbol is also kind of like the global symbol for accessibility. To give a definition of accessibility, I want to use the word usable, but I want to define the word usable before I do that. So I think of a usable product as being something that has an easy interface to use and it's functional. So using that definition, accessibility would be how usable and satisfying a product is to people with disabilities. So let's talk about a moral perspective. And to do that, I want to get help from Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the World Wide Web. He said that the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. Basically, it's the right thing to do, is what it gets distilled down to. Inaccessible websites serve as a barrier to access to the internet for a lot of people, and it's really frustrating for people that rely on assistive tech to not be able to use websites. Diversity and inclusion is something that we talk about a lot at Pivotal. I'm assuming a lot of other companies that anyone works for talk about it as well. And most people legitimately care about having a diverse workplace. Even if you're a developer who's working on an internal tool and you happen to know that every single user of that tool does not have a disability at the moment, if you do not incorporate accessibility into your product, it means that you cannot then hire anyone into that position that has any kind of a disability, and that is actually a form of workplace discrimination. It's also, I think, important to remember that when you talk about diversity and inclusion, it's about people you work with, it's also about your users. So we want to consider a diverse set of people as our users, including people with disabilities, and not treat them as a second-class citizen. I think it's useful frame of reference to remember that the internet has opened up a world of opportunity for everyone. And all of a sudden we have this information at our fingertips. It's exciting, and in some cases it's really empowering. And for people with disabilities, the internet is also really exciting and really empowering for the same reasons, but it's compounded by the fact that there is now information and operations that people previously literally could not do. It was impossible. And now with digital text that can be parsed by assistive technologies, there's all of these new things that people can do. So it's really exciting. There's all these technical advances that are empowering people in all these really cool ways. But the catch is that it's only positive and impactful if the software that we build is usable and accessible. So let's talk about it from a legal perspective, otherwise known as accessibility keeps you out of court. So I don't want to dwell on this image too much. Basically, what I'm trying to convey is that the number of lawsuits related to inaccessible websites is growing, and it's growing at pretty much an exponential rate. I couldn't find a good image that included 2019, but from my research, I can tell you that it's continuing that upward curve. So there's a growing number of lawsuits. And just to avoid confusion, I won't dwell on this for too long either, because I want to get to more stuff. But the two main laws that we talk about when we talk about accessibility are the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title III, which said that websites are a place of public accommodation. It's a civil rights law, and it applies to more commercial businesses. Then there's Section 508. And this is a federal procurement law, and it pertains to any applications that are built by or sold to a government entity. And both of these laws are enforced by consumers filing complaints. And as we can see from the previous slide, consumers are getting a lot better at filing complaints. So here is just a small subset of some well-known companies that have been sued. So from the larger ones like Netflix, sorry Netflix, you gave a good talk earlier, but they've been sued. And then down to the more startups like Blue Apron. And then you can see there's also there's educational institutions on here, there's government agencies. So how do you know if you're gonna be sued? Because I think most people wouldn't want to be sued. Well, unfortunately, it's a little murky. So according to the National Law Review, the Department of Justice, which is responsible for enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act, was working up until recently on incorporating the WCAG, which is a set of guidelines, into the definition. Unfortunately, current administration put that on hold. So we're left in a place of a little bit of uncertainty. Luckily, I do have a solution for you, though. And the solution is just to do the best you can with the information that you have to make your websites as accessible as possible right now. Let's talk about from a practical sense. So 1 in 5 Americans have a disability, and then if you operate internationally, according to DQ, and that number is anywhere from 10 to 20%. So it's worldwide. So even if we take the very low estimate of that, we say 10% of people, if 10% of people are unable to use your website, that has a pretty profound impact on the bottom line, and you're actually losing real dollars, and a lot of them. Another less altruistic point that I want to make is that this is going to affect you too. There's other disabilities that are sometimes not considered, like attention deficit disorder, like colorblindness. You can also consider short-term disabilities and situational context, so situational differences, I should say. So short-term disability, my roommate broke his arm last year, and he had to take a few days off of work because his arm was in a cast, his wrist was in a cast, and he couldn't use a mouse. And his internal software, he had to use at his job, wasn't accessible, wasn't keyboard accessible. That sucks. Situational differences, you may be outside on a sunny day, and if the color contrast on an application is not up to the right standard, it would be pretty hard to use the application on your phone or tablet or whatever else. The other thing to consider is that one day, hopefully, everyone in this room is going to become the same thing, and that is old. And as you get older, your vision is much more likely to become a lot more degraded, and then also short-term memory becomes more of a problem. So if all of us want to continue, even if we are totally able-bodied now, if we want to continue to use the internet that we love and depend on, it's probably in our best interest to make websites accessible, our products accessible now. So far we've covered some moral obligations, legal repercussions, and personal impact and legal impact as well. And all of these things are definitely important. That's why I talked about them. However, it's not the thing that gets me the most excited about making the products that I work on accessible, and it's not really the reason why I'm here to talk to you today. The thing I wanted to talk to you today about is this. Improving your product's accessibility enhances the usability for all users. Someone at Google said it better than I did. And I'd actually like to add to that and say that I think it also improves the developer experience for developers that are working on your application as well. Here's a few reasons. Accessible products do not rely on color alone to convey meaning. They're optimized for low visibility. They don't rely on the usage of mice. If anyone else is like me, like I don't like to navigate web forms with a mouse. I prefer to tab through and use my keyboard just because I like it better, and it's frustrating to me when I can't do that. Show of hands of how many people here have written like end-to-end, sometimes they're called journey tests. It's basically like a test that will spin up a web driver and will complete a task for you. Yeah? Okay, cool. It's pretty, in my experience, if an application is easily navigated by a screen reader, it's also much more likely to be easily navigated by a web driver. And it's gonna make those selectors that you write in the code when you're writing this test a lot easier to write. It's also more easily navigated by an SEO bot, so you can improve your order in the search results. And also probably going to be more easily navigated by a sighted user. Accessible products also use simple language. They are more likely to be optimized for responsiveness, and they are comprised of consistent components with well-defined and more intuitive characteristics. So like a button is a button is a button. So because of all this, I would urge everyone to use accessibility to drive the development of your applications. And this gets to the accessibility-driven nature of this talk. In my experience, it's much easier, faster, more cost-efficient. Not to mention that if you try to tack it on at the last minute, it's much more likely to be a sloppy attempt. And it does expose somewhat of like a systematic neglect of users with disabilities. It shows that they're not a priority for you or your company if you do that. So let's get to some low-hanging fruit, which, by the way, these all have alt attributes on them. So that's a fun fact. You can do that with Google Slides. So the first thing that you can do is to use Semantic Html. It's otherwise known as just use the freaking button element. So who here has ever like seen or implemented, it's okay, you can admit it, an input tag and like tried to style it like a button and like made it act like a button? Yeah, Bart's done it. It's okay. So native HTML elements, if you use the ones out of the box, they come with a lot of built-in, usually accessible functionalities that developers usually want. There's some things that you can definitely override if you don't want it. And it also creates components that are more intuitive. They behave the way that users expect them to behave throughout the entire internet. Do you want to take a picture? Okay, cool. So here are some button freebies. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I will post these slides later, and you can see them. Okay, headings. Headings are important for screen reader users. In a survey, the majority of screen reader users, when they first come to a page, the first thing they'll do is they'll they'll scan through all of the headings on the page to get a sense of the structure of content to be able to more easily navigate through the page. Those of us who are sighted probably subconsciously do the same thing. So when your headings are out of whack and you don't use them, it makes it a lot more difficult for people that use screen readers to navigate your page. If you think of headings as kind of the scaffolding or like the skeleton of a web page, you can think of page regions, sometimes called landmark elements, as the content. So a lot of developers are familiar with these elements, but they don't necessarily use them, maybe because they don't give you that same out-of-the-box functionality that something like, say, a button would give you. I like to use them, particularly, I like the section one the best, because it helps me differentiate between what is a div, meaning just a random collection of elements, versus like, no, this is really a section of my web page, and it might have some kind of a characteristic, like it always has a heading on it, something like that. And you want to avoid just having a sea of divs, if you can. I think it makes it a better development experience. Another thing that you should always do to make your websites accessible is to label all form controls. This is true for cited and non-cited. You need to make sure that all inputs and selects and things like that have labels. There's a few different ways you can do that. People are probably familiar with the first one, which is just to use that for attribute on a label. Another totally legal way to do it is to wrap your input in a label element. It'll accomplish the same thing, and it'll work with assistive technologies. Sometimes it is allowed, you are allowed to leave off visual labels. In the example I have up there, it's pretty intuitive to understand that the search button is the label for the text box, and if you do that, just remember to let a non-sighted user know that by using Aria attributes, which I will explain a little bit more in just a minute. So once you start playing around with JavaScript, you can pretty much do anything you want. It's kind of a free-for-all, and that's cool, that's fun. Except for the fact that if you don't notify assistive technologies that dynamic content on the page has changed, then they have no way of knowing it. So luckily, there is a solution for this. Who knows what this is usually abbreviated to? Aria, it's fine. I knew you all were thinking it. So Aria does a few different things, but one of its primary benefits is that it makes it possible for JavaScript to talk with screen readers in ways that were impossible before. And Aria is just a spec that defines like a set of interactions. So I lifted these rules of Aria use from the W3C website, and I'll read them to you now. Number one, if there is a native HTML5 element with built-in behaviors, use it. This is my use Semantic Html. Number two, do not change native semantics unless you really have to. You can see in the first example, there's this weird like H1 that's given the role of a tab. Like, what is it? Is it an H1 or a tab? It's both. It's cleaner and much nicer to just make a heading what it is, a heading, and then just wrap it in a tab. So you have a tab with a heading inside. Number three, all Aria controls must be usable with the keyboard alone. If you can click, drag, drop, tap it, you should be able to do the same functionality with a keyboard. Number four, never use Aria to hide focusable elements from the accessibility tree, not to be confused with, there are some things that it's okay to hide from the accessibility tree, notably icons, like purely decorative icons, totally okay, you can hide those. Yeah, focusable elements need to be there. Number five, all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So in this example, that input is only associated with the thing above it just because it's next to it. It's not actually associated with it, which is a problem for someone that's using a screen reader and navigating to the different inputs. I didn't know where to put this, but I wanted to bring it up. It doesn't really fit into the flow, but I wanted to bring it up because it comes up all the time and people seem to be really confused by tab index. Basically, if you use native HTML, by default, it's gonna, all focusable interactable elements are gonna have a tab index of 0, which means that it's gonna show up in the tab order. I can tab through and it will focus on it. There might be instances in which I have an element that I don't want to be in the tab order, but I want to be able to programmatically focus on it by calling like window.focus. If you have an element that has that, you can give it a tab index of -1. And then a tab index of anything greater than 0 will redefine its priority in the tab order. So basically it'll take anything with over 1. If there's one element with a tab index of 1, another with a tab index of 2, and everything else has 0, the way the tab order will work, it will go to the one with 1, then 2, and then it'll do all the zeros. The secret about tab index is that ideally you should never really need to set it. There are definitely cases in which, especially -1 is useful. But if you are structuring your HTML in a logical order, I have had to legitimately use it. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've had to legitimately use tab index. Other than setting it to 0 for custom focusable elements. That sometimes happens. So I know that it can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming to know where to start. If you're excited and serious about making an existing application that is currently not accessible. So I came up with a short list of things that you can check and fix, like one by one. It can hopefully break down this more daunting task into more manageable chunks. The first thing you can do is you can just start by navigating your website and trying to complete tasks with a keyboard. When you're doing that, you should watch out for making sure that the focusable elements have visible focus state. In Chrome, that usually looks like a kind of a fuzzy blue outline. Other browsers, it looks different. You need to make sure that custom interactive elements are focusable. That's what I meant by setting tab index to 0 on those ones. You need to direct focus to dynamic interactive content. The best example I think of this is if a notification shows up on the page, you want the focus to go to that so that people will know that that notification has showed up. You need to make sure there's no keyboard traps. So keyboard traps will oftentimes trap you in a loop where you can't get out of it. The second, once you're done navigating your website with a keyboard, you can try it with a screen reader. For Mac users, I recommend using VoiceOver. It's not going, if you can traverse it with a screen reader, it doesn't mean that it's usable by all screen readers, so be careful about that, but it's a good way to spot check. You can start it up, and then on the Mac, it will give you a little pop-up that will ask you if you want to take a tutorial. I actually recommend doing the tutorial. I did it, and it's pretty useful. If you're a Windows user, the two most popular screen reader technologies are NVDA and JAWS. Another thing to look out for if you're, once you're navigating with a screen reader, you want to make sure that all meaningful inputs have understandable labels. So that includes making sure that images have alt attributes. You also want to make sure that the flow of information makes sense and that there's no hidden or unreachable content on the page with a screen reader. Okay, so here's some tools and resources that you can hopefully leave here with. So I wanted to do this thing where, let's see if I can do this. There's a Chrome tool that you can use. Oh, there we go. Oh, and I'm not connected to the internet. Dang it. I did not think about that. Well, that's okay. We'll do that another time. Basically, there's a Chrome tool that you can use that will, my mouse back here, you can pull up the Audit Panel and you can actually audit a website that you're on. the joke that I was gonna show you is that I was gonna audit GitHub, and I believe it had it gives you like a score too out of 100. GitHub had a 94, which is pretty good. And hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying this, but I did the same thing on the SpringOne platform website, and it got a 52%, so that's kind of awkward. And another thing that it gives you is it not only gives you a score, but then it also gives you helpful tips for what exactly the violations are, and it will even like highlight the elements on the page too. It's like the Audit Panel in Google Chrome. Yeah, it comes built in with, I think, Chrome 60 or 61. Yeah, it's like if you pull up the developer tools, yeah. Another thing I like to do is sometimes if I'm not sure what an element is supposed to look like or interact like, I have a few websites that I like to go to and just see how it works on that website. And I trust these websites as having pretty good accessibility. So Wikipedia actually has like pretty good accessibility. Expedia, which is a travel website, that was surprising to me, but it was pretty good too. Google does a really good job with accessibility, and GitHub was another one. And there's a bunch others, but those are some of my go-tos. And here are some additional helpful resources. The guidelines that I mentioned earlier, and these will be posted in the slide deck that I afterwards. But yeah, the web accessibility guidelines are kind of the de facto guidelines for how to make your websites accessible. Rod Dotson is an employee of Google, and he does these these little mini video casts that are really useful. And yeah, there's a lot more things. There's a few people you can follow on Twitter that have some pretty good content related to accessibility. Yeah. Oh, and then the accessibility Slack channel, we have this at Pivotal, and if you don't have it at your organization and you use some kind of an internal messaging app, it can be good to just foster a community for help with accessibility stuff. And yeah, that's it. I hope I left a little bit of time for questions. Oh yeah, we got a lot of time. Do we? No, we don't. We only have 2 minutes. We got 2 minutes. And I don't have I only that's my email if you want to contact me. Yes?
So with single page apps doing JavaScript and always swap the DOM out, does a JAWS or a screen reader know when the DOM changes?
Yeah, so the question was with single page apps like React or Angular, does the screen reader know when the DOM re-renders, right? Because it doesn't refresh. The answer is no, and I'm really glad you called that out. Sometimes when I give this talk, I include some specifics about that. So you need to do things like make sure that the focus state goes back up to the beginning of the page. That's one thing you're gonna have to manage with single page apps, and another thing is making sure that the title of the page also changes. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Is there good test software to test web pages to make sure that it works?
Yeah, so the question was about the testing, like incorporating that. I'm assuming you mean it's to some kind of like a CI pipeline. Yes, and in my experience, they have varying levels of certainty. So I've tried using some tools before that gave us so many false positives that we ended up ignoring it all, and it was just noise. And then it kind of stops being useful at all. Not to say that they don't have their place, but I found it much more useful for the people, individual members on the team, developers, product managers, designers, to educate ourselves on what is accessible. But yeah, I have a few, I think Axe Core is probably the best one out there right now for that. And I think I'm at time. So if you have any more questions, I'll just hang out around here. But yeah, thank you.